Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something a little different. No royal scandals, no inbred monarchs with chins that could open letters. Tonight we're going peasant mode. Specifically, we're diving into why you, yes you, lying there in your comfortable bed with your phone glowing in your face, would absolutely not survive a single week as a medieval peasant. So go ahead and dim those lights, get cozy, and be grateful you were born in an era with antibiotics and indoor plumbing. Trust me, you're going to need that perspective by the end of this. Now, when most people think about medieval times, they picture knights in shining armor, grand castles, maybe a dragon or two if they've been watching too much fantasy television. But here's the thing. For about 90% of the population, medieval life was less Game of Thrones and more game of survival. And spoiler alert, most people were losing. We're talking about the peasants, the serfs, the regular folks who spent their entire lives covered in mud, working until their bodies gave out, and then dying of something that today would be cured with a single course of medication. Romantic, right? Let's set the scene. It's somewhere between the years 1000 and 1500, give or take. You wake up one morning and, surprise, you're a peasant in medieval Europe. Maybe England, maybe France. Honestly, it doesn't matter much because it's going to be miserable either way. You don't own the land you work. You barely own the clothes on your back. Your entire existence revolves around farming someone else's fields, paying taxes you can't afford, and trying desperately not to die of dysentery, which, spoiler again, you probably will. First things first, let's talk about your new home, and I use the term home very loosely here. You're living in what's generously called a cottage, but what's really just a one-room shack made of wood, mud, and straw. The walls are wattle and daub, which is a fancy medieval way of saying sticks woven together and covered in a mixture of mud, dung, and whatever else was lying around. Yes, dung, animal feces mixed into your walls. Because why not start your architectural experience with a solid foundation of manure? The roof is thatch, which means it's made of dried straw or reeds. Sounds quaint, right? Rustic even. Except thatch roofs are basically fire hazards waiting to happen. They leak when it rains, which is constantly, and they're home to an entire ecosystem of insects, rodents, and birds that's decided to nest directly above where you sleep. Fun times. Inside this cozy little dung hut, you've got a dirt floor. Not hardwood, not tile, not even rough-hewn stone. Dirt. Just straight-up earth that turns into mud whenever it rains, which, again, is constantly. There's no separate bedroom, no kitchen, no bathroom. Everything happens in this one room. You sleep here, you eat here, you give birth here, you die here. It's the circle of life, medieval peasant edition. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a pile of straw on the ground, maybe with a rough woolen blanket if you're lucky. No mattress, no pillows, no thread count to speak of. Just you, some straw, and whatever bugs have decided to call that straw home. Bed bugs are a given. Fleas are everywhere. Lice are just part of your daily reality. You're basically a walking ecosystem at this point. There's a fire pit in the center of the room because that's how you cook and stay warm. No chimney, though, because those are for fancy people. The smoke just kind of hangs out in the room with you until it eventually finds its way out through the gaps in the roof or the door. Your eyes are constantly stinging and watering. You're breathing in smoke all day, every day. Your lungs are not having a good time. But hey, at least you're warm-ish. Light is another issue. During the day, you get whatever sunlight manages to squeeze through the one tiny window opening in your wall. There's no glass, obviously. Glass windows are for the wealthy. You've got a wooden shutter you can close when it's cold or raining, which means you're choosing between freezing and having light or being slightly warmer and sitting in the dark. At night, if you need light, you're burning a rushlight, which is basically a reed soaked in animal fat. It smells terrible, gives off almost no light, and is yet another fire hazard in your highly flammable straw house. Now let's talk about your schedule, because you're not here to relax. You're a peasant, which means you work a lot. From sunrise to sunset, basically every single day. There's no weekend. The concept of a 2-day break didn't exist for you. Sure, there are holy days, feast days, saints' days, and the church calendar does give you more days off than you'd think, maybe 60 to 80 days a year, depending on where and when you're living. But the rest of the time, you're working. What kind of work? Farming, mostly. Backbreaking, endless, soul-crushing farming. And you're not farming with modern equipment. You don't have a tractor. You don't have a combine harvester. You don't even have particularly good tools. You've got a wooden plow, maybe with an iron tip if your lord is feeling generous. You've got a scythe, a sickle, a hoe, and your own 2 hands. That's it. That's your agricultural empire. You wake up at dawn because sleeping in isn't an option when your survival depends on the harvest. You stumble out of your smoky hovel, probably coughing, definitely covered in bug bites, and head out to the fields. If you're a serf, which most peasants were, you don't even get to work your own land first. Oh no, you owe your lord labor service, which means several days a week you're working his fields before you can even think about working your own little plot, because feudalism is just that fair.
Let's say it's plowing season. You're out there behind an ox or a horse if you're lucky, a team of oxen if you're luckier, or possibly just pushing the plow yourself if you're at the bottom of the peasant hierarchy. You're walking back and forth across muddy fields, turning over the soil, trying to prepare it for planting. This takes hours, days, even weeks. Your back is screaming. Your hands are covered in blisters that pop and bleed and then turn into calluses so thick you can barely feel anything anymore. Then comes planting season. You're out there scattering seeds by hand, hoping the weather cooperates, hoping the birds don't eat all your grain, hoping you've appeased God enough that he doesn't send a plague of locusts or a killing frost or any of the other 1,000 natural occurrences that could destroy your entire food supply. Farming in medieval times is basically gambling with your life. You put in months of work and just pray that nature doesn't decide to ruin you. After planting comes the growing season, which you'd think would be easier, but no. You're weeding, you're watering if there's a drought, you're trying to keep animals out of the crops, you're praying constantly. And then comes harvest, which is the most intense period of the agricultural year. Every able body in the village is in the fields from dawn until well past dusk, cutting grain with sickles, binding sheaves, hauling everything to the Lord's barns first, because of course his cut comes before yours. Harvest time is made even more fun by the fact that you're racing with the weather. If the grain gets wet, it molds. If it molds, you can't eat it, and you starve. So you're working until your hands bleed, until you literally cannot stand anymore, just trying to get the harvest in before the rain comes. And when you're done with the Lord's fields, you get to do your own, assuming you have any energy left, which you probably don't. But wait, there's more, because farming isn't your only job. You've also got to maintain your cottage, tend to your vegetable garden, care for your animals if you have any, gather firewood, haul water, make and mend clothes, preserve food for winter, and about 100 other tasks that make up medieval peasant life. There's no such thing as free time. Every moment of every day is consumed by the desperate struggle to survive. Let's talk about food now, because you're probably getting hungry after all that imaginary manual labor. What's for dinner in your medieval peasant household? Well, the bad news is, it's bread. Again. The good news is, no, actually, there's no good news. It's just bread. Brown, heavy, dense bread made from whatever grain you manage to grow. Wheat if you're doing well, barley or rye if you're not, oats if things are getting desperate.
This bread isn't like the artisanal sourdough you're imagining. It's rough, it's coarse. It often has bits of grit in it from the millstone that ground the grain. It's hard enough that you sometimes need to soak it in water or ale just to be able to chew it. And you're eating this bread for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, every single day, for your entire life. Occasionally, you might have pottage, which is a thick stew made from whatever vegetables you can grow or forage. Onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, peas, maybe some herbs if you're feeling fancy. You're cooking this in an iron pot over your smoky fire, adding water and just letting it simmer for hours. It's not seasoned with much because spices are expensive and you are very much not wealthy. Salt is a luxury. Pepper might as well be gold. You're eating bland vegetable mush and being grateful for it. Meat is rare, very rare, unless you're poaching from the Lord's forest, which is illegal and could get you in serious trouble. You're not eating much in the way of animal protein. Maybe a chicken now and then if one of your hens stops laying. Maybe some bacon or salt pork a few times a year when you slaughter a pig. But mostly, your diet is grain and vegetables. That's it. Your protein sources are beans and peas and whatever you can manage. Dairy is a bit more common. If you have a cow or access to one, you might have milk, though you're more likely to turn it into cheese or butter because those keep longer. You might have eggs if you keep chickens, but again, these are valuable commodities that you might need to sell or trade, so you're not exactly living on omelets and cheese plates. Nutritionally speaking, you're not doing great. You're eating a lot of calories because you need them for all that manual labor, but you're deficient in pretty much everything else. Vitamin C is hard to come by, especially in winter, so scurvy is a real risk. Vitamin D is lacking because you're covered head to toe while working, and there's not exactly a medieval multivitamin you can take. Iron deficiency is common, especially for women. You're basically malnourished by modern standards, even if you're eating enough to not starve. And speaking of winter, let's talk about what happens when the growing season ends and you're stuck in your freezing mud hut for months on end. You've spent the autumn desperately trying to preserve enough food to last until spring. You've salted meat, you've dried vegetables, you've stored grain, you've done everything you can. But it's never quite enough. The hungry months of late winter and early spring are called that for a reason. You're rationing, you're stretching every last bit of food, and you're losing weight and strength at the exact time when you need to start the farming cycle all over again.
Your water situation isn't great either, by the way. There's no running water, no taps, no water filtration system. You're getting your water from a well if your village has one, or from a stream or river if it doesn't, and you're sharing that water source with everyone else in the village, plus all their animals. The concept of water sanitation doesn't really exist. You're drinking water that animals have waded through, that people have washed clothes in, that's downstream from who knows what. Waterborne illnesses are just part of life. Ale is actually safer to drink than water in many cases because the brewing process involves boiling the water, which does everyone some good, even if they don't understand germ theory. So yes, peasants, including children, are drinking weak ale pretty much constantly, not because they're all drunkards, but because it's literally safer than the water. Welcome to medieval public health. Your personal hygiene situation is also not great, though it's better than stereotypes suggest. Peasants did bathe, contrary to popular belief. Not daily, because hauling and heating that much water is a massive undertaking, but regularly enough. Maybe once a week, maybe a few times a month. You're washing yourself with cold water and maybe some lye soap if you've made it. Lye soap, for the record, is made from wood ash and animal fat and it's harsh enough to strip the skin right off you if you're not careful. You're washing your clothes even less frequently because you only have 1 or 2 outfits total. You've got your everyday working clothes, which are rough wool or linen, and maybe one slightly nicer outfit for church if you're doing well. These clothes are handmade, either by you or someone in your family, and they represent hours and hours of labor, spinning wool or linen into thread, weaving thread into cloth, cutting and sewing cloth into garments. When your clothes wear out, you patch them. When the patches wear out, you patch the patches. Nothing is wasted. And after all this, after working yourself to exhaustion, eating your bland bread and vegetable stew, freezing in your smoky hut, you get to pay taxes. Oh yes, taxes. Because your Lord needs to maintain his lifestyle somehow, and that somehow is you. You're paying taxes in labor, working his fields for free. You're paying taxes in goods, giving him a portion of your harvest. You're paying taxes in coin, if you have any, which you probably don't. There are fees for using the Lord's mill to grind your grain, fees for using his oven to bake your bread, fees for just about everything. The church wants its cut too. You're expected to tithe, to give 1/10 of your produce to the church. And before you think that's just a suggestion, remember that the church controls your entire spiritual afterlife, and the threat of eternal punishment is very real to you. So yes, you're giving up 10% of your precious food to the church, even when you can barely feed yourself.
By the end of day 1, you're exhausted, hungry, dirty, cold, and probably wondering how anyone survived this for more than a week, let alone an entire lifetime. And we haven't even gotten to the really fun stuff yet. The diseases, the injuries, the complete lack of medical care, the violence, the uncertainty, the sheer grinding poverty of it all. But that's where we'll pick up as we continue. For now, just appreciate your soft bed, your climate control, your easy access to food and clean water, and the fact that your walls are not made of manure. Medieval peasant life was, in a word, brutal, and you, dear listener, would absolutely not have made it. Sweet dreams. So, you've made it through your first day as a medieval peasant. Congratulations, truly. You're exhausted, you're hungry, and every muscle in your body is screaming. But here's the thing. Day 1 is actually the easy part, because now we need to talk about what happens when your body inevitably breaks down, when disease strikes, when injuries pile up, and when you realize that medieval medicine is less medicine and more hoping really hard while someone does something bizarre to you. Let's start with the obvious. You're going to get sick. Not if, when. And probably multiple times throughout your mercifully short life. The medieval period is basically a greatest hits compilation of every awful disease humanity has ever faced, and you, as a peasant, get to experience them all without any of the benefits of modern medicine. No antibiotics, no vaccines, no pain relievers beyond alcohol, and definitely no understanding of what's actually causing your suffering. The common cold exists in the medieval times, obviously, but here's the fun part. What we think of as a minor inconvenience, a few days of sniffles and maybe some lost productivity, can actually end you in the Middle Ages. Because that cold can easily turn into bronchitis, which can turn into pneumonia, which can absolutely take you out when you're already malnourished, overworked, and living in a damp, smoky hovel. Your immune system is not operating at peak performance, shall we say. Respiratory infections are everywhere. You're breathing in smoke from your indoor fire all day and night. Your lungs are already compromised. You're working outside in all weather, getting soaked by rain, freezing in winter, never really getting properly dry or warm. You're in close quarters with other people who are also sick, sharing your one-room house with your entire family, breathing the same recycled air. It's a perfect storm for spreading disease. Tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it, is absolutely rampant. It's a slow, wasting disease that makes you cough up blood, gives you fevers and night sweats, and gradually destroys your lungs over months or years. There's no cure. There's barely even treatment. You just slowly fade away while everyone watches, knowing they might be next. Fun fact, tuberculosis is contagious, and you're all living in extremely close quarters, so when one person gets it, there's a good chance it's making the rounds.
Dysentery, that fun intestinal disease we mentioned earlier, is everywhere. It's caused by contaminated water and food, which you're consuming constantly because sanitation is not exactly a priority in medieval Europe. You get severe diarrhea, cramping, fever, and dehydration. And here's the thing. Dehydration can end you very quickly when you don't have IV fluids or even clean water to drink. You're just losing fluid and electrolytes until your body gives up. It's not a pleasant way to go. Typhoid fever, same deal. Contaminated water, same symptoms. High fever, abdominal pain, headaches, and a slow descent into delirium and possibly the end. Cholera outbreaks happen. You get these waves of illness that tear through villages, taking out huge portions of the population in a matter of days. One day everyone's fine. The next, half the village is violently ill, and by the end of the week you're digging mass graves. Influenza, which we think of as just a bad flu, is a serious threat. The flu can end you, especially when you're already weakened by malnutrition and overwork. And it spreads like wildfire in medieval communities because, again, everyone's in close contact. Nobody's washing their hands properly because they don't know about germ theory. And you're all sharing the same water sources and living spaces. Then there's the plague. Oh, the plague. We have to talk about the plague. Specifically, the Black Death that hit Europe in the mid-1300s and proceeded to wipe out somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population. It's probably the single most catastrophic disease outbreak in human history, and if you're a medieval peasant, you have absolutely no defense against it. The plague comes in several forms. Bubonic plague, which is the most common, gives you these massive, painful swellings called buboes in your lymph nodes, your groin, your armpits, your neck, just swelling up with these horrible, agonizing lumps. You get a high fever, chills, weakness, and a pretty good chance of passing away within a week. Some people survive, but most don't. Then there's pneumonic plague, which attacks your lungs. You're coughing up blood, struggling to breathe, running a massive fever, and this form is directly contagious from person to person through respiratory droplets, which means it spreads even faster than the bubonic form, and it's even more fatal, with nearly a 100% mortality rate if left untreated, which it is because it's the 1300s and nobody knows what's happening.
Septicemic plague is when the infection gets into your bloodstream. Your fingers and toes turn black from gangrene. You go into shock, and you're basically done for. It's the rarest form, but also the most rapidly fatal. And the thing about the plague is, nobody understands it. The idea that it's spread by fleas on rats wouldn't be discovered for centuries. So people think it's bad air, or God's punishment, or an alignment of the planets, or Jews poisoning wells, which leads to horrible persecutions that we won't get into because this is supposed to be relaxing content. The point is, when plague hits your village, all you can do is pray, maybe run away if you have anywhere to go, and watch as everyone around you gets sick and passes. Entire families are wiped out. Villages are abandoned. Fields go unplowed because there's nobody left to work them.
The social order completely collapses in some areas. And if you survive, you're left traumatized, surrounded by loss, probably with some level of PTSD that nobody has a name for yet, and wondering when the next outbreak is coming, because it does come back. The plague returns in waves for centuries. But let's say you're lucky enough to avoid the plague. There are still so many other ways for your body to betray you. Smallpox is around, giving you a high fever, a distinctive rash that turns into fluid-filled blisters all over your body, and a decent chance of passing away, or being left horribly scarred and possibly blind. Measles exists, mumps exists, whooping cough exists, and takes out children at an alarming rate. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease, is still present in medieval Europe. You get these skin lesions, nerve damage, tissue damage, and gradual disfigurement. And because nobody understands that it's actually not very contagious, lepers are treated as unclean, forced to live apart from society, required to ring bells to warn people of their approach. It's a slow, isolating, miserable existence. Ergotism, also called St. Anthony's fire, happens when you eat grain that's been infected with a particular fungus. The fungus produces compounds similar to LSD, so you get hallucinations, convulsions, a burning sensation in your extremities, and sometimes your fingers and toes just straight up fall off from gangrene. It can cause whole villages to go temporarily mad when a bad batch of grain gets distributed. Fun times. Intestinal parasites are just a fact of life. You've got roundworms, tapeworms, whipworms, all setting up shop in your digestive system. They're stealing your nutrients, which you can't afford to lose because you're already malnourished. They're causing abdominal pain, diarrhea, anemia, and general misery. Deworming medication doesn't exist in any effective form, so you're just living with your parasitic passengers indefinitely. Skin infections are constant. You've got open wounds from farm work, you've got insect bites that get scratched and infected, you've got rashes from your rough woolen clothing, and you've got absolutely no antibiotics to treat any of it. A simple cut can turn into a serious infection. That infection can spread. You can develop blood poisoning and pass away from something that today would be fixed with a tube of antibiotic ointment. Tooth abscesses can actually end you, by the way. The infection can spread to your jaw, to your brain, into your bloodstream. People absolutely pass away from dental infections in the Middle Ages. Something that today requires a root canal and some antibiotics could be a sentence of suffering back then. Vision problems are also just something you have to live with. If you need glasses, too bad. Spectacles do start appearing in the late medieval period, but they're expensive and rare, definitely not accessible to peasants. If you're nearsighted or farsighted, you just struggle through life not seeing properly. If you develop cataracts, you go blind. If you get an eye infection, you might lose the eye. There's no corrective surgery, no eye drops, just hope that whatever's wrong doesn't get worse. Now let's talk about injuries, because farm work is dangerous and you don't have safety equipment or really any concept of workplace safety. You're using sharp tools all day, every day. Scythes, sickles, axes, knives. You're working with large animals that can kick you, trample you, or crush you against a wall. You're climbing on thatched roofs to repair them. You're working in all weather conditions when everything is slippery and visibility is poor.
You're going to get cut. A lot. Little cuts, big cuts, cuts that probably should have stitches, but you're just wrapping them in a dirty cloth and hoping for the best. You're going to get bruises, sprains, strains. You're going to drop things on your feet, hit yourself with tools, fall off things.
and every single one of these injuries has the potential to become much worse. Break a bone, hope it heals straight, because medieval bone setting is imprecise at best and completely ineffective at worst. You might end up with a crooked limb, chronic pain, limited mobility. Break a leg badly enough, and it might get infected, and then you're looking at either watching the infection spread or having the limb removed, which in medieval times means someone sawing through your leg while you're awake, maybe drunk if you're lucky, and then hoping you don't bleed out or develop an infection in the stump. The survival rate for amputations is not great. Back injuries are extremely common given the amount of heavy lifting and bending you're doing. Herniated discs, chronic back pain, muscle strains that never quite heal because you can't take time off to rest. You just keep working through the pain because if you don't work, you don't eat. So you're creating a cycle of injury and re-injury that leaves you increasingly debilitated as you age. Head injuries happen. You get kicked by a horse, you fall and hit your head, you get hit by falling objects. Concussions are not understood. If you're confused and dizzy after a head injury, people just figure you're a bit touched and hope you get better. Traumatic brain injuries can leave you with lifelong problems that nobody has any way to treat. Burns are another constant risk. You're cooking over an open fire every day. You're working around fire for heat and light. Your clothing is long and flowing and highly flammable. You can easily catch fire, spill boiling water on yourself, or burn yourself on hot cookware. Minor burns are painful and prone to infection. Major burns are often fatal, either from the initial injury or from subsequent infection. And here's the real problem. For all these injuries and illnesses, medieval medicine is essentially useless. Not because the people trying to help are stupid, they're not, but because they're working with a completely incorrect understanding of how the human body functions.
Medieval medicine is based largely on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea is that illness is caused by an imbalance in these humors, and treatment involves trying to rebalance them. Which sounds reasonable until you realize this leads to treatments like bloodletting, where they deliberately make you bleed to remove excess blood, which is the exact opposite of helpful when you're already sick and weak. They're using leeches to suck your blood. They're making cuts in your veins to let blood flow out into a bowl. They're doing this for everything from headaches to infections to fevers. And shockingly, making sick people lose blood doesn't tend to improve their condition. It makes them weaker, more anemic, less able to fight off whatever's actually wrong with them. But the theory says it should work, so they keep doing it. Purging is another favorite treatment, making you vomit or giving you laxatives to expel the evil humors. So now you're sick and also violently emptying your digestive system from both ends, getting even more dehydrated, losing even more nutrients. It's great, really top-notch medical care. There are some herbal remedies that actually do help. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, which is similar to aspirin, so it can help with pain and fever. Honey has antibacterial properties and is actually good for wound care. Certain herbs can soothe stomach upset or help with sleep. So it's not all bad, but it's mixed in with a whole lot of nonsense. They're also using things like mercury and arsenic as medicines, which are literally poisons. They're applying poultices made of bread mold, which occasionally works because some molds produce antibiotic compounds, but they don't know why, and they're just as likely to apply a poultice of something useless or actively harmful. Surgeons exist,
but they're not the highly trained specialists we think of today. They're often barbers who do surgery on the side. The same guy who cuts your hair might also be the one pulling your teeth or trying to remove a growth or amputating your infected limb. Their tools are not sterilized because, again, germ theory doesn't exist yet. They're just rinsing them off between patients, if that. Cross-contamination is constant.
Anesthesia is limited to alcohol and maybe some opium preparations if you're lucky enough to have access to them. Most of the time, surgery means being held down while someone cuts into you and you just have to endure the pain. People go into shock. They pass out from pain. They thrash and scream. It's traumatic for everyone involved. And the thing is, even if you survive the surgery, the recovery period is dangerous. Your wound is going to get infected, probably, because everything is dirty and nobody's washing their hands or sterilizing equipment. You're just hoping your body can fight off the infection on its own. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't. Childbirth deserves its own section because it's uniquely dangerous for medieval women. If you're a woman of childbearing age, you're probably pregnant a lot. Birth control is not exactly reliable. There are some herbal preparations and barrier methods, but they're not widely known or widely used, and the church frowns upon them anyway. So you're having baby after baby after baby, which is exhausting and depleting your body. Each pregnancy is a risk. You can develop complications like eclampsia, which causes seizures and can end both mother and baby. You can have a placental abruption, hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, and when something goes wrong, there's very little anyone can do to help you. Labor happens at home, obviously. Hospitals aren't really for giving birth yet. They're more for the sick and dying. You're in your one-room cottage with a midwife if you're lucky, or just female relatives if you're not. These women have practical experience, but no formal medical training. They're doing their best with the knowledge they have, but their knowledge is limited. If labor is progressing normally, great. You're still going through hours of intense pain without any effective pain relief, but at least the outcome will probably be okay. But if labor isn't progressing normally, if the baby is breech or stuck, or there's some other complication, your options are grim.
The midwife might try to turn the baby manually, reaching inside to shift the baby's position. This is as painful and dangerous as it sounds. If that doesn't work, you might just labor for days, getting weaker and more exhausted until either the baby comes or you pass from exhaustion and hemorrhage. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, is a huge risk after giving birth. It's an infection of the reproductive tract caused by bacteria introduced during labor, and it's often fatal. You develop a high fever, pain, delirium, and pass away within days. Nobody understands that it's caused by lack of sanitation. They just think it's one of those things that happens sometimes. The connection between hand washing and infection won't be made for centuries. Even if you survive the birth and avoid infection, you're not out of the woods. You've just been through a major physical trauma. Your body needs time to recover. But you're a peasant, so you're back to work within days. You're hauling water, working in the fields, cooking, cleaning, all while trying to heal and nurse a newborn. Your body doesn't get the rest it needs. And we haven't even talked about the babies themselves. Infant mortality is staggeringly high. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of babies don't survive their first year. Some estimates are even higher. Children are dying from infections, from malnutrition, from accidents, from diseases that we can easily prevent or treat today. Babies are dying from something as simple as diarrhea because dehydration takes them so quickly. They're dying from respiratory infections, from whooping cough, from measles. They're dying because something went wrong during birth and they didn't get enough oxygen. If you make it past your first year, your odds improve, but not by as much as you'd hope. Childhood is still dangerous. You're facing all the same diseases as adults, but with a less developed immune system. You're having accidents while playing or working because child labor is absolutely a thing, and you're put to work as soon as you're able. You're falling into wells, drowning in streams, getting injured by farm animals or tools.
Malnutrition affects children especially hard. You need nutrients to grow and develop, but you're probably not getting enough protein, enough vitamins, enough minerals. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, leads to soft, deformed bones. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency causes bleeding gums, weakness, and poor wound healing. Anemia from iron deficiency makes you weak and pale and unable to fight off infections. The psychological toll of all this is something we should probably acknowledge, even though medieval people didn't have the vocabulary for it. Imagine watching multiple children pass away. That's just a normal part of life for medieval parents. You're having 6 or 8 or 10 children, and you're probably burying half of them before they reach adulthood. The grief must be absolutely crushing, but you don't have time to process it because you need to keep working to survive. You're living with constant uncertainty and fear. Will the harvest fail? Will disease sweep through the village? Will your lord decide to raise taxes and leave you unable to feed your family? Will there be a war and soldiers will come through destroying everything? There's no safety net, no savings account, no insurance, no government assistance. You're one bad season away from starvation, always. The violence of the era, though we won't dwell on it, is also a constant background threat. Bandits, raids, conflicts between lords, peasant uprisings that get put down. You could be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's it. Your life has so little value in the grand scheme of the feudal system. You're expendable, replaceable. And yet, people did survive. Obviously they did, or we wouldn't be here. But the ones who did survive were tough in ways we can barely imagine. They endured pain and hardship that would break most modern people. They buried their children and kept going. They worked until their bodies gave out. They survived famines and plagues and just kept getting up every morning to do it all over again. But let's be honest. You, specifically you, listening to this while lying in your climate-controlled bedroom, would not make it. You're too soft, and I say that with all the love in the world. We're all too soft for medieval peasant life. We're used to comfort and safety and medical care. We expect to live into old age. We expect our children to survive to adulthood. We expect that if we get sick, there's treatment available. A medieval peasant expected none of those things. They hoped, they prayed, but they didn't expect. And that fundamental difference in worldview, that acceptance of suffering and early loss as just the normal state of existence, that's what allowed them to survive. They didn't know any different. You do know different. You know that antibiotics exist, that surgery doesn't have to be agonizing, that childbirth can be relatively safe, that clean water is possible. And knowing all that, being suddenly transported to a time and place where none of it is available, where you're just expected to suffer and work and probably die young, that would break you mentally long before the physical hardships finished you off. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe send a little thanks to the universe that you were born in an era of modern medicine and sanitation and labor laws. Because the alternative, as we're discovering in excruciating detail,
is pretty much a nightmare. We're going to keep going, by the way. We haven't even covered the social aspects yet. The complete lack of freedom, the grinding poverty, the relationship with the church, the manor system, what happens when harvests fail, the daily indignities and humiliations of being at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. There's so much more medieval misery to explore. But for now, let your mind rest on the fact that every single inconvenience you face in modern life, every minor ache or pain or frustration, is absolutely nothing compared to waking up as a medieval peasant and knowing that today will be exactly as hard as yesterday, and tomorrow will be the same, and this is just your life until the day you die, probably before you hit 40 if you're lucky. Sweet dreams, everyone. Part 3 is coming, and it's going to be about the delightful topics of serfdom, feudal obligations, the church's role in keeping you oppressed, and what passes for law and justice when you have basically no rights. Restful content, truly.
All right, so we've covered the physical misery of being a medieval peasant. The disease, the injuries, the awful food, the terrible living conditions. But now we need to talk about something that might actually be worse than all of that. The fact that you're not free. Like, at all. You can't just decide you're done with this peasant life and move to the city. You can't quit your job. You can't even leave the village without permission. You are legally bound to the land you work, owned by a lord you probably never met, trapped in a system designed to keep you exactly where you are for your entire life. Welcome to serfdom. Let's talk about what that actually means. So first, we need to clear up a common misconception. Serfs are not slaves, technically. Legally speaking, there's a difference. Slaves can be bought and sold as individuals. Serfs cannot. Serfs are bound to the land, not to a person. When the land changes hands, you come with it, like a particularly unfortunate piece of furniture, but you can't be separated from the land and sold off independently. So that's something, I guess. A very small something. But in practice, the difference between serfdom and slavery is pretty slim. You don't own your own labor, you can't leave, you have to work for your lord without pay, you need permission to get married, your children are born into the same condition you're in, you have almost no legal rights. So yeah, technically not slavery, but you'd be forgiven for not seeing much of a distinction. The feudal system works like this. At the top, you've got the king. He owns all the land, theoretically. He grants large portions of it to his nobles, his dukes and counts and earls, in exchange for military service and political loyalty. Those nobles grant portions of their land to lesser nobles, knights, and so on down the chain. And at the very bottom of this whole pyramid scheme, you've got the actual people who work the actual land. The peasants. You. Your lord, the guy who owns the manor you're tied to, he doesn't actually farm his own land. Of course he doesn't. That's what he has you for. You're living on his land, farming his fields, and in exchange for being allowed to exist there, you owe him labor, produce, and money. It's not a fair exchange. You don't get to negotiate terms. You're born into this arrangement, and you'll die in it.
Let's talk about labor service, because this is where a huge chunk of your time goes. As a serf, you owe your lord a certain number of days per week on his personal land, his demesne. This is called corvée labor, and it's not optional. The exact amount varies depending on where and when you're living, but it's typically anywhere from 2 to 5 days per week. Let's say 3 days a week on average, just to give us a number. 3 days a week, you're not working your own land, you're working his. Plowing his fields, planting his crops, harvesting his grain, maintaining his buildings, whatever needs doing. And these aren't short days. You're working from sunrise to sunset, just like when you're working your own plot. So half or more of your labor is going directly to your lord for free. But wait,
you might be thinking. If you're working his land 3 days a week, when do you work your own land to grow food for yourself? Great question. The answer is the other days of the week, plus nights, plus holy days when you're not supposed to be working, but you do anyway, because otherwise you'll starve. You're essentially working 2 full-time jobs, one for your Lord and one for yourself, and somehow trying to squeeze both into the same limited number of hours. And the labor service isn't just field work. Oh no, you've also got boon work, which is extra labor required during critical times like harvest. When it's time to get the Lord's grain in, everyone drops everything and works his fields until it's done. You might be working 12 or 14-hour days during harvest season on his land, and then having to find time and energy to harvest your own crops before they rot. There are other labor obligations too. You might have to maintain roads, repair bridges, work on the Lord's buildings, serve in his household. If he's constructing something or making improvements to the manor, guess who's providing the labor? For free. While your own work piles up and your own fields go untended. Now, in addition to labor service, you also owe your Lord a portion of your produce. This is separate from the church tithe. By the way, the church gets 10% and your Lord gets his cut on top of that. The exact amount varies, but let's say another 10 to 20% of whatever you manage to grow. So you're working your own land maybe half the time and then giving up a chunk of what you produce from that limited time. The math is not in your favor.
You're also paying rent, because of course you are. Even though you're providing all this free labor and all this free produce, you still owe rent for the privilege of living in your dung hovel on your Lord's land. This might be paid in coin, if you have any, or in additional produce, or in the form of chickens or eggs, or whatever else you can scrounge up. Then there are the fees. Oh, the fees. Medieval peasant life is just an endless series of fees for doing basic things necessary for survival. You need to grind your grain into flour so you can make bread, right? Well, your Lord owns the mill, and you're required to use his mill. You can't just grind your grain at home with a hand quern, even though that would be free and convenient. No, that's illegal. You have to use the Lord's mill and pay him a fee for the privilege. Usually about 1/16 of your grain, which doesn't sound like much until you remember how little grain you have to begin with. Same thing with baking. Your Lord probably owns a communal oven, and you're required to use it and pay a fee. You can't just bake bread in your own home, even though you have a fire right there. The oven monopoly is a nice little moneymaker for the Lord. There's a fee for using the Lord's wine press if you're in an area that grows grapes. There's a fee for using communal pasture land for your animals. There's a fee called tallage that's basically just the Lord deciding he needs money and taking it from you. There are fees when your daughter gets married, fees when you die and your heirs inherit your land tenure, fees for just about everything. One particularly insulting fee is called merchant, which is what you pay for permission to marry off your daughter. Because your daughter is also tied to the land, and if she marries someone from another manor, that's labor lost to your Lord, so you have to compensate him for the loss, because apparently your child is livestock. There's also heriot, which is a death tax. When you die, your Lord gets to claim your best animal or your best possession as a fee before your heirs can inherit anything. So your family is grieving, and also they're losing the best ox or cow or horse right when they need it most to keep the farm running. It's a great system. Very compassionate. In some areas, there's something called mortuary, which is similar but owed to the church.
Your second best animal goes to the parish priest when you die. So between Harriet and mortuary, your family is losing 2 of your best animals right off the bat. Hope you had more than 2. You need permission for all sorts of things. Want to marry? Need the Lord's permission. Want to leave the manor, even just to visit the next village over? Need permission. Want to send your son to learn a trade instead of farming? Permission. Want to enter the church? Permission. You are not in control of your own life in any meaningful way. And if you don't fulfill your obligations, if you can't pay the fees or provide the labor or hand over the produce, there are consequences. You can be fined, which is ironic because the reason you didn't pay is usually that you don't have anything to pay with, but now you owe even more. You can be put in the stocks for public humiliation. You can have your possessions seized, such as they are. In extreme cases, you can be evicted from your land, which is basically a death sentence because where are you going to go? The manor system is set up to be completely self-contained and self-sustaining, with your lord as the absolute authority. The manor is both an economic unit and a political one. Your lord's estate includes his house or castle, his personal farmland, the village where you live, the fields you work, common lands for grazing, forests, streams, everything. And he controls all of it. The manor has its own court, called a manorial court or hall mote, where legal disputes are settled and crimes are punished. Your lord or his representative presides over it. You can bring disputes against your fellow peasants here, like if someone's cow damaged your crops or someone owes you money. But good luck getting a fair hearing if your dispute is with the lord himself or one of his officials. The reeve is the guy who manages the day-to-day operations of the manor. He's usually a peasant himself, elected or appointed from among the villagers, which sounds democratic until you realize it's basically the worst job ever. The reeve has to make sure everyone's fulfilling their labor obligations, collect the rents and fees, organize the planting and harvest schedules, and generally serve as the middleman between the lord and the peasants. Everyone hates him because he's enforcing the lord's demands, but he's also one of you, so he gets it from both sides. The bailiff is another official, more directly employed by the lord, who oversees the reeve and makes sure everything's running smoothly. He's less likely to be sympathetic to peasant problems because his loyalty is clearly to the lord. The hayward is in charge of fences and boundaries, making sure animals don't get into the crops. The woodward manages the forest resources. There's a whole little bureaucracy set up to keep the manor functioning and, more importantly, to keep you working. The fields themselves are usually organized in an open field system. Instead of everyone having their own compact farm, the arable land is divided into big fields, and those fields are divided into strips. You get a bunch of strips scattered around the different fields. Your neighbor has strips near yours. Everyone's strips are all mixed together. This is supposed to be fair because some land is better than others, so everyone gets a mix of good and bad strips. But it also means you can't just do whatever you want with your land. Everyone has to plant the same crops at the same time and follow the same schedule because the fields are managed collectively. Typically, there's a 2-field or 3-field rotation system. In a 3-field system, one field grows winter crops like wheat or rye, one field grows spring crops like oats or barley, and one field lies fallow to recover. Each year, the rotation shifts. This is actually pretty smart agriculture for the time, maintaining soil fertility and spreading out the labor and the risk. But it also means you have no flexibility. You plant what everyone else is planting when they're planting it. The common lands are areas where everyone can graze their animals, gather firewood, maybe forage for nuts or berries. These are essential resources that you depend on, but access can be limited, and the Lord can decide to enclose common land for his own use, which periodically happens and causes all sorts of conflicts. The forest is the Lord's personal property, and this is serious business. You can't just go into the forest and hunt deer or boar. That's poaching, and it's harshly punished. The forest and the game in it belong to the Lord and the king. You are a peasant. You don't get to eat venison. If you're caught poaching, you're looking at fines you can't pay, physical punishment, mutilation like losing a hand or worse, all for trying to feed your family.
You can gather dead wood from the forest usually, fallen branches for your fire, that sort of thing. But you can't cut down trees. You might be able to let your pigs forage for acorns in the forest at certain times of year, for a fee, of course, but the forest resources are tightly controlled, and you're very much at the bottom of the priority list. Now let's talk about the church, because the church is deeply embedded in every aspect of medieval peasant life, and not always in a comforting way. On one hand, the church provides the only real community gathering space you have. The village church is where you see your neighbors, where you celebrate festivals, where you mark the important moments of life. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, all happen at the church. It's the one building in the village that's made of stone, that's built to last, that's at least somewhat beautiful. In a life that's mostly mud and toil, the church offers something transcendent, a connection to the divine, the promise of a better existence after this miserable one ends. The priest is often the only literate person in the village. He reads the Bible to you in Latin, which you don't understand, but that's fine, because you're not supposed to understand. You're supposed to have faith. The Mass is conducted in Latin, the prayers are in Latin, and you just absorb what you can through the rituals and the imagery. The church calendar structures your entire year. You know what time of year it is by what saint's day is coming up, or what religious festival you're celebrating. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the Feast of St. John, Michaelmas, all these holy days break up the monotony of farm work and give you something to look forward to. On holy days, you're not supposed to work, which is a blessed relief. You go to Mass, you might get a special meal if you can afford it, you rest. But here's the thing, the church also takes from you constantly. The tithe, that 10% of your produce we mentioned earlier, that's mandatory. It's not optional charity, you owe it. There's the great tithe on major crops like grain, and the small tithe on everything else, livestock, vegetables, even the products of your labor like eggs or wool. The church tells you that this is God's due, that supporting the church and the clergy is your Christian duty, that you'll be rewarded in heaven for your generosity. But it's hard to feel generous when you're handing over food your children need and watching the local priest live more comfortably than you ever will. Not all priests are corrupt or lazy, to be fair. Many are genuinely trying to serve their communities with the limited resources and education they have. But some are absolutely taking advantage of their position. They're supposed to be celibate, but they've got mistresses or even unofficial families. They're supposed to live modestly, but they're collecting tithes and fees and living pretty well. They're supposed to provide spiritual guidance, but some can barely read and are just going through the motions of the Mass. Then there are the pardoners and the indulgence sellers who come through periodically, selling forgiveness for sins, promising reduced time in purgatory for you or your dead relatives if you just give the church money you don't have. It's a racket, and even at the time, some people recognize it as such. But what are you going to do? Risk your immortal soul by refusing?
The church also has a lot of rules about sex and marriage that impact your life. Sex outside of marriage is a sin. Sex inside marriage is only acceptable for procreation, not pleasure. There are all these rules about when you can't have sex: during Lent, on Sundays, on holy days, during your wife's menstrual cycle, during pregnancy. If you're following all the church's rules, you're supposed to be having sex a couple dozen days a year, which is probably not happening, but you're supposed to feel guilty about it. Marriage is a sacrament, and it's permanent. No divorce. If your spouse is abusive or awful, or you're just desperately unhappy, too bad. You're stuck. Till death do you part. And given the life expectancy, that's probably not as long as it would be today, but it can still feel like forever. The church preaches acceptance of your lot in life. You're a peasant because that's the role God assigned you. The social hierarchy is divinely ordained. The king is king because God wants him to be. Your Lord is your Lord because that's God's plan. You're at the bottom because that's where you belong. Trying to change your station in life isn't just impractical, it's sinful. It's going against God's design.
This is actually very convenient for the people at the top. If the church is telling everyone that the social order is sacred and rebellion is a sin, that keeps things stable. It keeps you obedient. It keeps you working and paying and suffering without making too much trouble. There's this concept of the three estates, the three orders of society: those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobility; and those who work, everyone else, meaning you. Each estate has a role. The clergy tend to spiritual matters, the nobility provide protection and governance, and you provide the labor that supports everyone. It's all very neat and balanced in theory. In practice, it means you're doing all the actual work while everyone else benefits. Heaven is your reward for suffering through this life obediently. The meek shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. All these biblical principles that suggest maybe being a poor, suffering peasant is actually a blessed state, spiritually speaking. You'll get your reward after you die. Just keep working and don't complain. It's a pretty effective system of social control, honestly, and most people genuinely believe it. This is the worldview you're raised with from birth. Everyone you know accepts it as true. The priest says it's true, and he's God's representative on earth, so it must be true. Questioning it probably doesn't even occur to you as an option. Now, let's talk about law and justice, or the lack thereof. As a peasant, you have basically no legal rights in the wider world. You can't testify in royal courts. You can't bring suit against a nobleman. Your oath is less than a noble's. If a crime is committed against you by someone of higher status, good luck getting justice.
Within the manorial system, you've got the manorial court we mentioned earlier. This handles local disputes, minor crimes, enforcement of the Lord's rules. If your neighbor's pig destroyed your vegetable garden, you can bring a complaint here. If someone owes you money, you can try to get it back through the court. If someone's been stealing, or there's been an assault, or someone's not fulfilling their labor obligations, it gets handled here. The court meets periodically, maybe every few weeks or once a month. It's usually held in the Lord's Hall, or sometimes outside in good weather. The Lord or his steward presides. There might be a jury of sorts, other peasants, who hear the case and render a verdict. It's based on customary law, the traditional rights and obligations that have built up over generations in this particular manner. Customary law is both your protection
and your prison. On one hand, it says that the Lord can't just arbitrarily change the terms of your service. You owe what your ancestors owed, no more. If the custom is that you owe 3 days of labor per week, he can't suddenly demand 4. The custom protects you from unlimited exploitation. On the other hand, custom also locks in all those obligations and fees we talked about. You can't argue that serfdom is unjust because it's custom. It's the way things have always been done. Custom is law. Punishments in manorial court are usually fines for minor offenses, which is a problem when you're broke, but still better than physical punishment. For repeat offenses or more serious crimes, you might be put in the stocks, a wooden framework that holds your head and hands in place while you sit or stand in the village square and everyone mocks you. It's humiliating, it's uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be a deterrent. For serious crimes, things go beyond the manorial court. If there's been a serious incident, you might end up in the royal justice system, which is not a good place for a peasant to be. Trials might involve compurgation, where you swear your innocence and get a bunch of people to swear they believe you. Or trial by ordeal, where you're subjected to some painful test, and if you're innocent, God will protect you.
Trial by ordeal is exactly as barbaric as it sounds, though we won't get too graphic here. The idea is that God will reveal the truth through miraculous intervention. Spoiler alert, God does not actually intervene, and plenty of innocent people suffer. Punishments for serious crimes can include mutilation, branding, or being put to an end, depending on the crime and the era and the local laws. As a peasant, you're more likely to face harsh punishment than a noble would for the same crime. Your life has less value in the legal system. There's also the concept of outlawry, where someone who's committed a crime and fled is declared outside the protection of the law. Anyone can harm or end an outlaw without legal consequence. It's basically a death sentence because you can't survive long without the protection of the community and the law. Women have even fewer rights than men, which is saying something. A woman is under the legal authority of her father until she marries, and then under her husband's authority. She can't own property independently in most cases. She can't enter into contracts. She can't bring legal cases without a male guardian. If her husband mistreats her, her legal recourse is basically non-existent. When a woman's husband passes, she might get a dower, a portion of his holdings that supports her for the rest of her life, usually about 1/3 of his holdings. But this is controlled by the lord and local custom, and there's a lot of room for widows to be cheated out of what they're owed. Marriage among peasants is as much an economic arrangement as a romantic one. You're combining 2 households, 2 sets of labor, 2 strips of land. Love might develop, but it's not the primary consideration. Compatibility as work partners is more important than emotional connection. You need the Lord's permission to marry, as we've mentioned. You might need to pay that merchant fee. Your families are negotiating what each side brings to the marriage. The woman might bring a small dowry if her family can afford it. The man needs to be able to support a household, which means having land tenure and the tools to work it. Once you're married, you're immediately expected to start having children, because children are labor. They're helping in the fields as soon as they can walk. They're scaring birds away from the crops, gathering eggs, watching younger siblings, spinning wool.
By the time they're 7 or 8, they're doing real work. By their teens, they're working adult hours. Childhood as a protected period of play and education doesn't really exist for peasant children. You get a few years of being small and relatively useless, and then you're expected to contribute. There's no schooling for you. You're learning by doing, following your parents around, absorbing the skills you'll need through observation and practice. Your children are probably not all going to survive to adulthood, as we've discussed, and the ones who do survive are going to inherit your status. They're going to be serfs just like you. They're going to work the same land, owe the same obligations, live the same hard life. There's no social mobility, no chance for them to rise above their station. Well, that's not entirely true. There are a few escape routes, but they're narrow and not available to everyone. If you're a younger son and there's no land for you to inherit, you might be able to leave and become a laborer in a town. Towns have different laws than manors. There's a saying, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free. If you can escape to a town and live there for a year and a day without being caught, you're legally free. But getting to a town, surviving there, finding work, that's all easier said than done. The church is another potential escape route. If you can enter a monastery or convent, you're leaving the secular world behind, including your serfdom. But monasteries often require a donation when you enter, which your family probably can't afford, and you need your lord's permission to leave, which he might not give, because he's losing a worker. For women, entering a convent might be the only way to avoid an unwanted marriage or to get some education and autonomy. Nuns can learn to read and write. They can hold positions of authority within the convent. They can have a life that's not defined by childbearing. But again, it's not accessible to most peasant women. Military service might be an option during wartime, though as a peasant you're more likely to be conscripted for support roles than to become a knight. If you're serving in the Lord's retinue or the king's army, you might earn some money or favor, but you're also risking your life, obviously. Some people do just run away. They abandon their land and their obligations and flee, hoping to start over somewhere else. But where are you going? You have no money, no skills beyond farming, no network of support. You're an outsider everywhere you go. And if you're caught, the consequences are severe. The reality is that for the vast majority of peasants, you're born into this system and you die in it. Your life is predetermined. You'll live in the same village your ancestors lived in. You'll work the same land. You'll owe the same obligations. You'll marry someone from the same village or maybe the next village over. You'll have children who will do exactly the same thing. Generation after generation, century after century. The psychological weight of this must be crushing, even if you don't have the framework to articulate it. You're trapped. You can see the nobility riding by in fine clothes. You know the church officials live in relative comfort. You're aware that there's a whole world beyond your village that you'll never access, but there's nothing you can do about it. You find meaning where you can, in your family, in your faith, in the cycle of the seasons and the satisfaction of a good harvest. You take pride in your work, even though most of the benefit goes to someone else. You find joy in feast days and community celebrations. You love your children desperately, even knowing how hard their lives will be. You endure because what else can you do? And the system is designed to keep you enduring, keep you compliant. The combination of legal bondage, economic exploitation, religious justification, and the sheer difficulty of survival leaves no room for rebellion, or even much room for thought beyond getting through the next day. There are peasant uprisings, of course, throughout the medieval period. When things get too unbearable, people do rise up. The Jacquerie in France, the Peasants' Revolt in England, various other rebellions and protests. They're usually put down swiftly and brutally, and the survivors are often worse off than before. But the fact that they happen at all shows that there are limits to how much people will endure. After the Black Death, when so much of the population has been wiped out, the surviving peasants suddenly have leverage. There's more land than there are people to work it. Lords need laborers and have to compete for them. Wages go up. Obligations get lighter. Some serfs are able to negotiate their freedom. The whole feudal system starts to crack. But we're talking about the height of the medieval period here, before the plague changed everything. We're talking about when the system is at its strongest and you are at your most trapped. So add it all up: the backbreaking labor, the terrible living conditions, the disease, the malnutrition, the lack of medical care, the complete absence of freedom, the endless obligations and fees, the powerlessness, the social immobility, the grinding poverty, the subordination to lords and church officials who take and take and take while giving back almost nothing.
Could you survive a week of this? Physically, maybe, if you're in decent shape and you don't get immediately sick or injured. But mentally? Emotionally? Knowing that this isn't just a week, that this is your entire life stretching out ahead of you with no hope of change or improvement. Knowing that your children will inherit this same misery. You'd break. Of course you would. We all would, because we've been raised with the expectation of freedom and choice and opportunity. We expect our lives to improve, or at least to have the chance to improve them. We expect to have some control over our destinies. A medieval peasant expected none of that. They accepted their lot because they had no choice, and because the entire structure of their society told them this was natural and right and ordained by God. But you, arriving in that world with modern sensibilities and modern expectations, you'd see it for what it is: a brutal, exploitative system that treats human beings as resources to be used up and discarded. And that knowledge, that contrast between what life could be and what it actually is for you in this moment, that would be unbearable. So yeah, you wouldn't survive a week as a medieval peasant. Not really. Not intact. Not as yourself. Let's keep drifting through this historical nightmare, shall we? There's still more to cover. We haven't fully explored the seasonal cycles, the specific daily routines, what happens during famines, the role of women in more detail, the village social dynamics, the few small pleasures that made life even slightly bearable. We're going to keep going until we've painted the complete picture of just how thoroughly you would not make it in medieval peasant society. Rest easy in your modern comfort. We'll continue this journey through medieval misery shortly.
All right, we're in the home stretch now. We've covered the physical suffering, the diseases, the feudal bondage, the complete lack of freedom and rights. But to really understand why you wouldn't survive as a medieval peasant, we need to go deeper into the actual rhythm of daily life, the seasonal cycles that dictate everything you do, the endless, repetitive tasks that fill your days, what happens when things go really wrong, like famine, and somehow, despite all of this, the tiny moments of joy or community that kept people going. So, let's settle in one more time and walk through the full circle of the medieval peasant year. We'll start in spring, because that's when the agricultural cycle really kicks into gear and your life becomes even more consumed with work than usual, which is saying something. It's March or April, depending on the year and the weather. Winter is finally loosening its grip. You survived the hungry months, barely. You're weak from months of reduced rations. You're vitamin deficient. You're probably sick with something, because everyone gets sick in late winter when resistance is low and you're all trapped inside together. But the weather is warming up, the days are getting longer, and it's time to start the farming cycle all over again. First comes plowing. If your village uses a 3-field system, you're plowing the field that's been lying fallow, turning over the soil to prepare it for planting. This is brutal work. You're walking behind a heavy wooden plow, pulled by oxen if you're lucky enough to have them or access to them. If you're really poor, you might be pulling the plow yourself, or working together with neighbors who also don't have draft animals, taking turns pulling and guiding. The plow doesn't work like modern equipment. It doesn't turn the soil over completely. It basically just scratches furrows in the ground. You have to go over the same field multiple times in different directions to really break up the earth. This takes days, weeks even, for the whole village's fields. Your back is screaming. Your hands are blistered bloody from gripping the plow handles. The oxen are stubborn and difficult. The plow keeps hitting rocks and roots and getting stuck. It's cold and wet because spring weather is unpredictable. So you're working in the rain and the mud, soaked through, freezing. But you can't stop because the planting window is limited. Plant too early and a late frost might destroy your seeds. Plant too late and the growing season is shortened. You're gambling with the weather and hoping you get it right.
Once the plowing is done, it's time to plant. You're scattering seeds by hand, walking up and down your strips, broadcasting the grain in handfuls. Wheat, barley, oats, rye, whatever's appropriate for the field rotation and the season. Some seeds will be eaten by birds, some will fail to germinate, some will sprout and then die. You're planting way more than you'll actually harvest because the failure rate is high. After the seeds are in the ground, you're harrowing, dragging a heavy wooden frame with teeth across the field to cover the seeds with soil. More walking, more physical labor, more hoping the weather cooperates. And you're doing all of this on the Lord's land first, remember. Your own fields wait until His are done. So by the time you get to plant your own crops, you're already exhausted and you've lost valuable time. Spring is also when lambs are born if you have sheep, calves if you have cows, piglets if you have pigs. Baby animals need care and attention. The mothers need extra food, which you don't really have. You're trying to keep the babies alive because they represent food and income and breeding stock for the future. But mortality rates are high. Things go wrong during birth. Animals get sick. Predators get into your enclosures. You lose animals, and there's nothing you can do about it. This is also when you're shearing sheep if you have them, getting the wool that you'll spend the rest of the year processing into thread and cloth. Shearing is skilled work. Do it wrong and you injure the sheep. Do it too early and the sheep might get cold. Too late and the wool quality suffers. It's just another thing to worry about. Your vegetable garden needs planting too. You're putting in onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, herbs. This is your personal food supply, separate from the grain fields. The vegetables supplement your diet and might be the difference between adequate nutrition and deficiency diseases. So you're tending your garden whenever you have a spare moment, which is almost never.
Spring also means foraging. You're gathering wild greens, nettles, dandelions, whatever's edible. After months of stored grain and preserved foods, fresh greens are desperately needed. They taste good, they provide vitamins, they're free. You're in the woods and hedgerows whenever you can be, gathering food to supplement your meager supplies. By May or June, things are growing. The fields are green with sprouting grain. Your garden is coming up, but now you're weeding, constantly weeding. Weeds compete with your crops for nutrients and water, so they have to go. You're on your hands and knees in the fields pulling weeds by hand, hours every day. It's monotonous, backbreaking work, but it has to be done. You're also watching the weather obsessively. Too much rain and the crops might rot or get fungal diseases. Too little rain and they'll wither. A hailstorm can destroy months of work in minutes. There's nothing you can do to control any of this. You just watch and worry and pray. Summer is slightly less frantic than spring, but you're still working constantly. There's always something that needs doing. Maintaining fences and buildings, caring for animals, tending the garden, hauling water, making repairs. If you're a woman, you're also spinning and weaving, making and mending clothes, preparing food, caring for children. The work never stops. This is also when you're doing boon work for the Lord, those extra labor obligations we mentioned. Haymaking happens in early summer. The Lord's meadows need to be mown, the hay gathered and stored for winter animal feed. Everyone turns out for this. You're cutting grass with scythes, raking it to dry, bundling it, hauling it to the barns. It's hot, sweaty work. The hay dust makes you cough and sneeze. You're working from dawn to dusk, coming home exhausted and getting up the next day to do it again. Late summer, around August, is harvest time. This is the most critical period of the entire year. Everything depends on the harvest. If it goes well, you eat. If it doesn't, you starve. The pressure is immense.
The grain is ready when it's golden and the heads are heavy and starting to droop. You have to harvest it at exactly the right time. Too early and the grain isn't fully developed. Too late and it might shatter and fall to the ground, or birds will eat it, or weather will ruin it. You're watching the fields, testing the grain, waiting for the perfect moment. And then it's all hands on deck. Everyone who can work is in the fields. You're cutting grain with sickles, bending over, grabbing a handful of stalks, cutting them near the base, over and over and over. It's repetitive and exhausting. Your back feels like it's breaking. Your hands are cramping. The sickle blade needs constant sharpening. The sun is beating down on you. You're covered in sweat and grain dust and chaff. Behind the cutters, other people are gathering the cut grain into sheaves, bundles that get tied together. Then the sheaves are stacked into shocks to dry. Everything has to be done quickly and carefully. Any grain that falls to the ground is lost, so there's pressure to be efficient but not wasteful. You're working the Lord's fields first, of course. Days of this brutal labor on His harvest before you're allowed to touch your own. And all the while you're looking at the sky, terrified of rain. If the cut grain gets wet before it's fully dry, it can mold or sprout, and then it's useless. Once the grain is cut and dried, it needs to be threshed to separate the grain from the stalks and winnowed to separate the grain from the chaff. Threshing is done with flails, beating the grain until the kernels separate. Winnowing is done by tossing the grain in the air and letting the wind blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain falls back down. It's dusty, tedious work that takes days.
Finally, after all this, the grain goes to the Lord's mill to be ground into flour, with the appropriate fee taken out. And then you can make bread. After months of work, you have bread. Assuming the harvest was good. If it wasn't, well, we'll get to that.
Autumn is when you're trying to preserve as much food as possible for winter. If you're slaughtering animals, it's often done in late autumn because you can't afford to feed them all through the winter. You keep your best breeding stock and slaughter the rest. The meat gets salted or smoked to preserve it. Nothing is wasted. Organ meats, blood, intestines, everything gets used. You're harvesting your vegetable garden, pulling onions and root vegetables, picking the last of the beans and peas. Anything that can be dried or stored gets processed and put away. Apples or other fruit get turned into cider or dried or stored in cool places. You're gathering the last of the nuts from the forest. Every bit of food you can scrape together is essential. This is also when you're fattening up the pigs on acorns and forest forage, if you have pigs and access to the forest. Pigs are valuable because they can turn forage into meat and they reproduce quickly. A pig can be the difference between a hard winter and an impossible one. You're cutting and storing firewood, so much firewood. You need it for cooking and heating, and you'll burn through an enormous amount over the winter. Gathering wood is constant work, cutting it, splitting it, stacking it, hauling it. Your woodpile is never quite big enough. By late autumn, the work in the fields is mostly done. The land is going dormant, and you're facing the prospect of another winter trapped in your freezing, smoky hovel with dwindling food supplies and nothing to do but try to survive until spring. Winter is the quietest time of year in terms of outdoor work, but that doesn't mean you're resting. There's always indoor work. The women are spinning and weaving constantly, trying to produce enough thread and cloth for clothes and blankets, and to sell or trade for things you need. It's tedious work, spinning on a drop spindle or a spinning wheel, hour after hour, turning raw wool or flax into thread, then weaving the thread into cloth on a loom, then cutting and sewing the cloth into garments. One outfit represents hundreds of hours of labor. Men are doing maintenance and repairs, fixing tools, mending fences, working on the house, making things you'll need for the next farming season, carving wooden tools, repairing harnesses, whatever needs doing. Everyone's hungry. By midwinter, you've been living on stored food for months. The supplies are dwindling. You're rationing, eating less each day, stretching everything as far as it will go. By late winter, you're down to the dregs. Grain that's maybe starting to mold. Preserved meat that's more salt than meat. You're counting the days until spring when there will be fresh food again, and hoping you make it that far. The cold is relentless. Your fire helps, but it doesn't heat the whole space evenly. You're cold all the time. You sleep huddled together with your family for warmth. You wear all your clothes at once, layering everything you own. You stuff straw into your shoes and wrap your feet in rags. It's never enough. Illnesses sweep through in winter. Respiratory infections, influenza, the same diseases we talked about earlier. People die more in winter than any other season, especially the very young and the very old. You might lose grandparents. You might lose children. You have funerals in frozen ground, somehow digging graves in earth that's hard as stone.
But you endure, you survive, and when spring comes around again, you start the whole cycle over, year after year after year, the same rhythm, the same work, the same struggles. It's relentless and unchanging. Now let's talk about what happens when things go really wrong, when the harvest fails.
Crop failures happen for all sorts of reasons. Weather is the big one. A late frost in spring destroys the sprouting plants. A drought in summer withers them. Too much rain causes flooding or fungal diseases. Hail beats down the standing grain. An early frost in autumn ruins the harvest before it can be gathered. The weather is completely beyond your control, and it can destroy you. Pests and diseases also destroy crops. Locusts or other insects can devour fields. Fungal blights can spread through the grain. Rodents get into your stored supplies. You have limited options for dealing with any of this. You can try to scare away birds and animals. You can pray for divine intervention, and that's about it. When a harvest fails, you're immediately in crisis mode. The grain you are counting on to feed your family and pay your obligations doesn't exist. You still owe the Lord his portion. You still owe the church its tithe, but you have nothing to give. The fees and rents are still due, but you have no food and no money. The first thing that happens is you start eating your seed grain, the grain you were supposed to save for planting next spring. Because you have to eat now or you'll die before spring arrives. But eating your seed grain means you won't have anything to plant, which means next year's harvest will also fail. You're creating a cycle of famine that's hard to break. You slaughter animals you were planning to keep for breeding. You forage desperately for anything edible. Bark from trees, roots, anything. People eat things that aren't really food and get sick from it. Ergot-infected grain that causes poisoning. Moldy grain that causes illness. You're making terrible choices because all the choices are terrible. Prices for grain skyrocket because everyone is desperate to buy, and there's not much for sale. If you have anything of value, you sell it for food. Tools, animals, household goods, anything. You go into debt, borrowing grain or money at exorbitant rates, promising future labor or a share of next year's harvest if you survive to see it. Starvation is a slow process. You don't just suddenly die. First, you're hungry all the time, a gnawing, painful hunger that never goes away. Then you're weak. You can't work as hard, which means you fall behind on obligations, which creates more problems. You lose weight. Your muscles waste away. Your immune system fails. Children and the elderly go first. They need food, but they're the least able to work for it, so they get the smallest portions.
Babies stop nursing because their mothers are too malnourished to produce milk. Children's growth is stunted. Old people fade away. Then adults start dying. Starvation, or more often, complications from malnutrition. Your body can't fight off infections. Minor illnesses become fatal. People develop edema, swelling from fluid retention because their bodies aren't functioning properly. They become lethargic, confused, unable to care for themselves. Social bonds start to break down under the pressure. Desperate people do desperate things. Theft increases. People steal from each other, from the Lord's stores, from the church. They get caught and punished, which makes things worse. Families fracture. Parents abandon children they can't feed. People wander off looking for food or charity elsewhere and die on the roads. Some famines are localized. One region has a crop failure while others are fine. In theory, food should be redistributed, but that doesn't really happen effectively. Transport is difficult, there's no centralized relief system, and the people with grain are hoarding it or selling it for maximum profit. The free market doesn't save you. Some famines are widespread. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 affected all of northern Europe. Years of excessive rain destroyed crops. Millions of people died. It's estimated that 10 to 15% of the population perished. Entire villages were abandoned. The social fabric tore, and the people who survived were traumatized and weakened, which set them up for the Black Death a decade or two later.
After a famine, assuming you survive, everything is harder. You're starting from behind. You have no resources. You're in debt. You're physically weakened. You have to rebuild. Borrow seed grain. Start over. Hope next year is better. Some people never recover. They sink into permanent poverty, unable to climb back out. And the thing is, famines are not rare. They happen every few decades, sometimes more often. It's a regular feature of medieval life. You might experience several famines over your lifetime. Each one takes a piece of you. Now let's talk more specifically about women's lives, because we've touched on this, but it deserves more attention. If you're a woman in medieval peasant society, you're working just as hard as men, but you're also dealing with pregnancy and childcare, and you have even fewer rights. Your work is divided between field work and domestic work, and honestly, you're doing both. During critical periods like planting and harvest, you're absolutely in the fields working alongside the men. You're planting, weeding, harvesting, binding sheaves, all of it. The idea that medieval women didn't do agricultural labor is false. Everyone works the fields. But you're also responsible for all the domestic labor, cooking, which is a huge job when you're starting with raw ingredients and cooking over an open fire. Hauling water, which means walking to the well or stream, filling heavy buckets, and carrying them back to your house multiple times a day, every day. Water is heavy. Your back and shoulders are constantly strained.
You're doing laundry, which is brutal work. You're hauling water, heating it if you can afford the fuel, scrubbing clothes against rocks or in tubs, wringing them out, hanging them to dry. For a whole family's worth of clothing and linens, this is an all-day affair that happens periodically.
You're making and mending all the clothes, spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving thread into cloth, cutting and sewing cloth into garments, patching worn areas, darning holes, letting out or taking in garments as children grow or as people lose or gain weight. This is constant, ongoing work that fills any spare moment you have. You're preserving food, making cheese and butter, salting meat, drying vegetables. You're tending the vegetable garden and the chickens if you have them. You're gathering eggs, feeding animals, milking cows or goats. And on top of all this, you're pregnant a lot. And pregnancy while doing hard physical labor is rough. You're still hauling water and working in the fields while pregnant. There's no maternity leave. You work until you literally go into labor, and then you're back to work within days of giving birth. Childbirth, as we discussed, is dangerous. You're giving birth at home with a midwife, and you're facing all those potential complications with no real medical help. You're risking your life every single time. And then you're nursing the baby while still doing all your regular work. You're strapping the baby to you and taking it to the fields. You're trying to keep it safe and fed while also fulfilling all your obligations. It's exhausting.
Women's work is undervalued, even though it's essential. The economic contribution of women is enormous. The cloth production alone is vital, but it's seen as just what women do, not as skilled labor deserving of recognition. If you're unmarried, you're under the authority of your father. When you marry, you transfer to your husband's authority. You can't own property independently, can't enter contracts, can't represent yourself legally. If your husband is abusive, which some definitely are, you have essentially no recourse. The church says marriage is sacred and permanent. Your neighbors might sympathize, but there's nothing they can do. You're stuck. If you're widowed, you're in a precarious position. You might have a dower that provides some support, but you're a single woman trying to work land and fulfill obligations that normally take two adults. You might remarry quickly out of economic necessity, or you might struggle on alone, falling into poverty. There are some limited forms of female power. Older women, mothers and grandmothers have authority within the family and respect in the community. Women who are skilled in healing or midwifery have valuable knowledge. Women run households and manage resources and make daily decisions. But this is all within a framework that ultimately subordinates them to male authority. Let's talk about village social dynamics, because your community is everything. You're not isolated. You live in a village with anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred other people, and these people are your whole world. Everyone knows everyone. You've known these people your entire life. You grew up together. You work together. You worship together. There's no privacy. Everyone knows your business. Who's getting married, who's pregnant, who's sick, who's struggling, who's had a good harvest and who hasn't. It's a tight-knit community because it has to be.
There's cooperation because certain tasks require it. Plowing, harvesting, maintaining common resources. You're pooling labor and resources, helping each other out. If your neighbor's house burns down, the community comes together to help rebuild. If someone's sick or injured, neighbors help with their work. It's mutual aid out of necessity. But there's also conflict because people are people. Disputes over land boundaries, over animals that damage crops, over debts and obligations, jealousies and resentments, old grudges that get passed down through generations. The manorial court exists partly to mediate these conflicts, but they don't always stay resolved. There's a social hierarchy.
even among peasants. Wealthier peasants who have more land and more animals look down on poorer ones. Freemen, peasants who aren't serfs, have higher status than serfs. Skilled workers like the blacksmith or the miller have respect and relative prosperity. Everyone has their place, and everyone knows it. Reputation matters immensely. If you're known as a hard worker, as honest, as reliable, that helps you. People will cooperate with you, help you when you need it. If you're known as lazy or dishonest, you're socially punished. People won't help you. You'll struggle to find marriage partners for your children. Gossip and social pressure enforce community norms. The village has its rhythms and traditions. Feast days are celebrated together. Harvest home, when the harvest is complete, there's usually some kind of celebration. Christmas, Easter, May Day, all the holy days and traditional festivals. These are breaks in the routine, chances to socialize and relax a little, to eat better food if any is available, to drink and dance and forget the hardships for a moment. There's folk culture, songs and stories passed down orally, local saints and their miracles, superstitions and folk beliefs that exist alongside official church doctrine, belief in fairies, in spirits, in omens and curses. The church officially frowns on this stuff, but people believe it anyway. It's part of the worldview, a way to explain things that otherwise don't make sense.
Marriages and funerals are community events. Everyone attends, everyone participates. When there's a wedding, the whole village celebrates. When someone dies, everyone mourns. These shared experiences bind the community together. The church is the literal center of village life. The church building is where you gather, where important announcements are made, where you mark the passage of time. The bells ring to mark the hours, to call people to services, to announce deaths or dangers. The church calendar structures your year. You know what month it is by what liturgical season you're in. But despite the community bonds, there's also loneliness and isolation. You're surrounded by people, but you might not be able to express your true feelings or doubts. The pressure to conform is strong. If you question the social order or the church's teachings, you keep it to yourself. If you're unhappy in your marriage or your life, you don't talk about it much, you endure. So what makes life bearable? What small pleasures exist in this hard existence? Food when you have it. A feast day meal that includes meat or special bread or ale. It's not gourmet by modern standards, but compared to daily bread and pottage, it's wonderful. The satisfaction of eating until you're full, which doesn't happen often. Ale, which you're drinking regularly because it's safer than water. It's weak ale, not strong enough to get you drunk unless you really try, but it provides calories and a mild mood lift, and it's pleasant.
Rest when you can get it. The feeling of sitting down after a long day of work, lying down to sleep even on your pile of straw when your body is screaming with exhaustion. Holy days when you're not supposed to work, so you can actually relax a bit. Community and belonging. Sitting around a fire with neighbors, sharing stories, singing together during work or celebrations. The bonds with your family, your spouse, your children. Love exists even in these hard circumstances. People care for each other, laugh together, find moments of joy. The cycle of seasons and the satisfaction of a job completed. Getting the harvest in, knowing you'll eat this winter. Seeing the fields turn green in spring after a long winter. The first lambs of spring, Baby animals that are adorable even when you're mainly thinking of them as future food. Religious faith provides comfort for many, the promise of heaven, of a better existence after this hard life, the sense of connection to something greater than yourself, the beauty of the church services, the music, the ritual. For people who genuinely believe, and most do, this is real consolation. Children, despite the hardship and the risks, watching your children grow, teaching them, seeing yourself continue into the next generation, the hope that maybe things will be a little better for them, even though realistically they probably won't be. Small beauties, a sunset, a bird singing, flowers in spring. The medieval world is not all mud and misery. Nature is there, and people notice it and appreciate it even when they're struggling.
Stories and songs, imagination and creativity. People make up ballads about local events or heroes. They tell folk tales to children. They create beauty where they can, even in poverty. Embroidery on a piece of clothing, a carved wooden spoon, a carefully tended garden. Humans create even in the hardest circumstances. Sex and physical intimacy, though the church tries to regulate it heavily, people are people. They desire connection and pleasure, and they find it where they can. These small pleasures don't make up for the hardship, not even close. But they're what keep people going. They're the bright spots in a dark existence. They're what make life worth living, even when life is brutally hard. And here's the thing. Medieval peasants didn't necessarily think of themselves as miserable. This was just life. They didn't have modern life to compare it to. They didn't know that food could be abundant and varied, that medicine could actually cure diseases, that people could live into their 80s, that children could reliably survive to adulthood. They didn't know that social mobility was possible, or that individual freedom was a thing you could have. They accepted their lot because they had to, and because they believed it was ordained by God. They took pride in their work, even though most of the benefit went to others. They survived, and even found moments of happiness within the constraints of their existence. But you, modern person, you know all the things they didn't know. You know what life can be. You have expectations of comfort, health, freedom, opportunity, and suddenly being stripped of all of that, being plunged into medieval peasant existence, would be psychologically devastating. The physical hardships would be bad enough. The endless work, the poor diet, the absence of medical care, the constant illness and pain. Your body would break down quickly. You'd be covered in injuries and infections. You'd lose weight, lose strength. You'd age rapidly under the strain. But the mental and emotional toll would be worse. The hopelessness of knowing that this is your life now, with no escape. The frustration of having no control over your own existence. The grief of watching preventable suffering and not being able to prevent it. The rage at the injustice of the system, the exploitation, the casual cruelty of the social hierarchy. You'd probably try to change things at first. Try to explain to people that serfdom is unjust, that the social hierarchy isn't natural or divinely ordained, that better ways of living are possible.
and people would think you're mad or heretical. You'd be told to stop questioning God's plan. You'd be socially punished for nonconformity. You'd learn very quickly that resistance is futile and dangerous. And then what? You either break completely or you somehow shut down that part of yourself that knows better and try to accept this new reality. You'd go through the motions, work the fields, pay the fees, attend church, repeat. You'd become numb because feeling the full weight of your situation would be unbearable. Or maybe you'd try to escape, run away to a town, try to disappear. But where would you go? You have no money, no skills that translate outside of farming, no connections. You'd be a stranger everywhere, vulnerable and lost. You'd probably be caught and returned, and then punished for running. And even if you made it to a town, life there isn't necessarily better. Urban poverty has its own special miseries. The point is, you wouldn't make it. Not as yourself. Not intact. The person you are now, with your modern sensibilities and expectations, that person couldn't survive in medieval peasant society. You'd either break or you'd have to fundamentally change who you are to adapt. And either way, the you that exists now would be gone.
So, as we come to the end of this very long journey through medieval peasant misery, let's just sit with that for a moment. Let's appreciate the fact that we live in a time and place where you can go to a doctor when you're sick and actually get treatment that works. You can expect to live into old age. You can expect your children to survive to adulthood. You have access to varied, nutritious food whenever you want it. You have clean water at the turn of a tap. You have shelter that's warm and dry and not made of manure. You have clothes that you didn't have to make by hand. You can read and write and access information freely. You can choose your own path in life, at least to some extent. You have rights and legal protections. You're not owned by anyone. You're not bound to land you don't own, working for someone else's benefit. Are modern times perfect? No, of course not. There are still inequalities, still injustices, still suffering. But compared to medieval peasant life, we're living in absolute luxury. Every single one of us, even people who are struggling by modern standards, have access to things that medieval peasants couldn't even imagine. Antibiotics alone are a miracle that has saved countless lives. Indoor plumbing is a gift we take for granted every single day. The fact that childbirth is relatively safe now, that infant mortality is low, that we can prevent and treat diseases that used to destroy entire populations, these are achievements we should never stop appreciating. The social progress is just as important. The idea that all people have inherent dignity and rights, that slavery and serfdom are wrong, that women are full human beings deserving of equal treatment, that children should be protected and educated, not worked to exhaustion, that government should serve the people, not the other way around. None of this was obvious or accepted in the medieval period. People fought and suffered and died to establish these principles. So yeah, you wouldn't survive a week as a medieval peasant. You'd hate every minute of it. The work would destroy your body. The powerlessness would break your spirit. The suffering all around you would crush your soul. And you should be profoundly grateful that you don't have to.
As you drift off to sleep tonight in your comfortable bed in a climate-controlled room
with a full belly and modern medicine available if you need it, with freedom and opportunity and a future that isn't predetermined by the circumstances of your birth. Just feel that gratitude. Feel how lucky you are to exist in this moment in history rather than as a medieval peasant. Sleep well, friends. Dream of anything except medieval peasant life. And when you wake up tomorrow, maybe take a moment to appreciate your indoor plumbing, your coffee maker, your refrigerator full of food, your freedom to do basically whatever you want with your day. These are luxuries that 90% of humans throughout history never had. We've reached the end of our journey through medieval peasant misery. We've covered the terrible living conditions, the disease and injury, the feudal bondage, the endless labor, the famines, the lack of rights, the grinding poverty, the complete absence of freedom. We've painted a complete picture of why you, specifically you, would absolutely not survive a week in that world. And now you can let it all drift away. Let the knowledge settle into your mind as you relax into sleep. Be grateful for the modern world with all its flaws, because at least you're not a medieval peasant. At least you have choices and opportunities and a reasonable expectation of surviving past 40. At least your children have a chance at better lives. At least you can go to sleep without wondering if you'll have food tomorrow, or if you'll survive the winter, or if disease will sweep through and take everyone you love. Rest easy, sleep deep, and be grateful. This has been your journey through medieval peasant life. Thank you for sticking with me through all of it. Now close your eyes and let sleep take you, secure in the knowledge that you'll wake up in the 21st century where you belong. Sweet dreams, everyone.